Grantley Caper was an Englishman, born, according to his passport, in Birmingham. He was 42 years of age. His wife, to whom he'd been married for 11 years, was of German birth and parentage. That was public knowledge. Information about his antecedents was contained in a private document. According to this, he'd started his career in a lawyer's office in Birmingham and had then drifted into journalism. He'd been connected with an English paper in Cairo and with another in Shanghai. There he got into trouble for attempting to get money on false pretenses and was sentenced to a short term of imprisonment. After his release, all trace of him was lost for 2 years when he reappeared in a shipping office in Marseille. From there, still in the shipping business, he went to Hamburg, where he married, and to London. In 1914, at the outbreak of war, Caper was living quietly with his German wife at Southampton. In the beginning of 1915, he told his employers that his wife's nationality was making his position intolerable, and they granted his request to be transferred to Genoa. Here he remained till Italy entered the war, but then gave notice, crossed the border, and took up residence in Switzerland. These facts were of no importance to anyone until it was discovered that Caper, certainly from the beginning of the war and perhaps earlier, was in the service of the German intelligence department. From then on, his letters, and he received a good many, were closely censored. There were few codes that the people who dealt in such matters couldn't, in the end, decipher. Even so, no steps were taken against him. He could do no great harm, and it might even be possible to use him to convey information that it was desirable to let the enemy have. Then Caper did something that drew R's attention to him. He scraped acquaintance in Zurich with a young Spaniard, Gomez by name, who'd lately entered the British Secret Service, and managed to worm out of him the fact that he was engaged in espionage. On Caper's information, the Spaniard was watched when he went to Germany, and one day caught as he was posting a letter in a code that was eventually deciphered. He was tried, convicted, and shot. R wasn't pleased, but it occurred to him that if Caper was merely betraying his country for money, it might be possible to get him to take more money to betray his employers. But R had no notion what kind of man Caper was, so he instructed Ashenden to get acquainted with him and see whether there was any chance that he would work honestly for the British. If Ashenden thought there was, he was authorized to sound him out and make certain propositions. If, on the other hand, Ashenden came to the conclusion that Caper couldn't be bought, he was to report his movements. It was known that the head of the German intelligence department in Bern, a Major von Posen, was growing restive at Caper's lack of activity. In his coded letters, Caper had been asking for a higher salary, and Major von Posen had told him that he must earn it. And so, a week later, Ashenden found himself in Lucerne, signing into a small, spotlessly clean German hotel of the second class. The landlady was curious to know why, in that dead season, he'd come to stay. He told her that he'd recently recovered from an attack of typhoid and had come to Lucerne to get back his strength. He was employed in the censorship department and was taking the opportunity to brush up his rusty German. He asked her if she could recommend a German teacher. The landlady, a blousy Swiss, good-humoured and talkative, would, Ashenden felt pretty sure, repeat the information in the proper quarter. It was his turn now to ask a few questions. She was voluble on the subject of the war, on account of which the hotel was nearly empty. She had only 2 lots of resident guests. One was an old Irish couple who lived in Vevey and passed their summers in Lucerne, and the other was an Englishman and his wife. She was a German, and they were obliged on that account to live in a neutral country. Dinner was at 7, and Ashenden went down as soon as he heard the bell. It was a plain, whitewashed room, very neat and clean. Presently 1 or 2 persons came in, single men with some occupation in Lucerne. They propped newspapers against their water jugs and read while they somewhat noisily ate their soup. Then a tall, bent man with white hair and a drooping white moustache came in, accompanied by a little old white-haired lady in black. These were certainly the Irish colonel and his wife of whom the landlady had spoken. At last came the persons for whom Ashenden had been waiting. He was doing his best to read a German book, and allowed himself to raise his eyes for an instant. His glance showed him a man of about 45, with short dark hair and a broad, red, clean-shaven face. He walked ahead of his wife, and of her Ashenden caught only a glimpse. Grantley Capor sat down and began explaining to the waitress that they'd taken an immense walk up some mountain. "Serve me quick, we're starving. And bring beer, 3 bottles. Lieber Gott, what a thirst I have." He seemed a man of exuberant vitality. He began to talk to his wife in English, but presently she interrupted him in an undertone. Capor stopped, and Ashenden felt his gaze fixed intently upon him. When Ashenden had finished his dinner and went out into the hall, he saw a bull terrier tied to a table leg. In passing, he fondled the dog's drooping soft ears. The landlady was standing at the foot of the stairs. "That's Fritzi. He belongs to Herr Capor." Ashenden decided to take no steps to make Capor's acquaintance. If Capor was being pressed for results, it must surely occur to him that an Englishman employed in the censorship department would be worth knowing. He didn't have to wait long. Next day he was sitting in the doorway of the hotel drinking a cup of coffee after lunch when the Capors came out of the dining room. Mrs. Capor went upstairs, and Capor released his dog, which bounded along and leapt up against Ashenden in friendly fashion. "Come here, Fritzi," cried Capor, and then to Ashenden, "I'm so sorry, but he's quite gentle." "Oh, that's all right. He won't hurt me." Capor called to the maid, "A coffee, please, Fräulein." He turned to Ashenden. "You've just arrived, haven't you?" "Yes, I came yesterday." "Are you staying?" "For a while. I've been ill and I've come here to recuperate." Hesitatingly, Ashenden explained the facts that he told the landlady the day before, and that he was convinced she'd already passed on to Capor. "You couldn't have come to a better place than Lucerne. It's an oasis of peace in this war-weary world. That's why I've come here. You see, I married a German lady." "Oh, really?" "No one could be more patriotic than I am. I'm English through and through, but at the beginning of the war my poor wife had a very rough time in England. Everyone thought she was a spy. It'll make you laugh when you know her. She's the typical German Hausfrau, who cares for nothing but her house, her husband, and our only child, Fritzi." Capor fondled his dog. "Yes, Fritzi, you are our child, aren't you? Naturally, it made my position very awkward. I'm a journalist, and my editors weren't quite comfortable about it. Well, to cut a long story short, I thought the most dignified course was to resign and come to a neutral country till the storm blew over. By the way, I don't know if you know my name, Grantley Capor." "My name's Somerville," said Ashenden. He told him then about his work in the censorship department, and moved on to say that he was looking for someone to give him conversation lessons in German. As he spoke, he saw that it occurred to Capor that it would be a very good plan for Ashenden's teacher to be his wife. However, nothing was said, and at that moment Mrs. Capor came downstairs, and her husband joined her. They walked down the road, Fritzi bounding round them, and Ashenden saw that Capor immediately began to speak animatedly. That evening Ashenden went into dinner as the Capors were finishing. On their way out of the dining room, Capor stopped and asked him if he'd drink coffee with them. When Ashenden joined them in the hall, Capor got up and introduced him to his wife. She bowed stiffly in response to Ashenden's civil greeting. Mrs. Capor was a plainish woman, nearing 40, with a muddy skin and vague features. She was squarely built, plump rather than fat, but looked a woman of character. "I have not told you, my dear," said Capor, "that Mr. Somerville is looking for someone to give him conversation lessons. I said perhaps that you could suggest a teacher."
"I know no one I could conscientiously recommend," she answered. "The Swiss accent is hateful beyond words. It could do Mr. Somerville only harm to converse with a Swiss." "If I were in your place, Mr. Somerville," said Capor, "I'd try to persuade my wife to give you lessons. She is, if I may say so, a very cultivated and highly educated woman." "Ach, Grantley, I have not the time. I have my own work to do." Ashenden saw that the trap was prepared, and all he had to do was fall in. He turned to Mrs. Capor with a manner that he tried to make deprecating and modest. "I should look upon it as a real privilege if you would give me lessons. Naturally, I wouldn't want to interfere with your work. I'm just here to get well, with nothing in the world to do, and I would suit my time entirely to your convenience." He felt a flash of satisfaction pass from one to the other. "Of course it would be a purely business arrangement," said Capor. "There's no reason why my good wife shouldn't earn a little pin money. Would you think 10 francs an hour too much?" "I'd think myself lucky to get a first-rate teacher for that." "What do you say, my dear? Surely you can spare an hour, and you will be doing this gentleman a kindness. He would learn that all Germans are not the devilish fiends that they think them in England." She made a visible effort. "I shall be very pleased to give Mr. Somerville conversation lessons." It was agreed that the lessons would start at 11 the following morning. Mrs. Capor had clearly agreed to the arrangement under protest, but she was a born teacher, and as the hour progressed, it was clear that she meant to do her job conscientiously. And indeed she gave her lessons with the greatest thoroughness, but every day she came with the same sullen face, and it was only her interest in teaching that allowed her to lose for a moment her instinctive dislike of him. Mrs. Capor was a fanatic. Obsessed with the superiority of all things German, she loathed England with a virulent hatred. Her ideal was a world ruled by Germany, in which the rest of the nations would enjoy the benefits of German science and German culture. As to her relationship with her husband, Ashenden divined that this unprepossessing woman and that mean, fat man were joined together by a deep and sincere love. It seemed to him that Mrs. Capor loved her husband because she'd made him what he was. She loved him notwithstanding his weakness, for given her clear head, she must always have been conscious of that. But then there was the espionage. To betray your country for money is not a very pretty proceeding. How had she persuaded herself into forcing her husband to adopt so dishonourable a calling? Grantley Capor was another story. There was little to admire in that gross and vulgar fellow. Ashenden watched with entertainment the way in which the spy tried to inveigle him in his toils. It was a couple of days after his first lesson that Capor, after dinner, his wife having gone upstairs, threw himself heavily into a chair by Ashenden's side. His faithful Fritzi came up to him and put his long muzzle with its black nose on his knee. "Have you had him long?" asked Ashenden. "I got him just before the outbreak of war. By the way, what do you think of the news today? Of course, my wife and I never discuss the war. You can't think what a relief to me it is to find a fellow countryman to whom I can speak freely. It's the greatest grief of my life that, owing to my wife's nationality, I was unable to do any war work. I don't mind telling you, if the war goes on much longer, wife or no wife, I'm going to do something. With my knowledge of languages, I ought to be of some service in the censorship department. That's where you were, wasn't it?" That was the mark at which he'd been aiming, and Ashenden now passed on certain information already prepared, which could be of no value at all to the Central Powers. When they parted, both had reason to be satisfied. Ashenden guessed that Capor's typewriter would be kept busy next morning, and that the extremely energetic Major in Bern would shortly receive a most interesting report. The following Sunday, Capor told Ashenden that he and his wife were going on an excursion and would have lunch at some little mountain restaurant. He suggested that Ashenden should come with them. They started early.
Mrs. Capor businesslike in her walking boots, Tyrolese hat and alpenstock, and Capor in stockings and +4s, looking very British. They reached the inn with its view of the mountains and the lake, and lunched deliciously off scrambled eggs and mountain trout. Even Mrs. Capor was moved to an unwonted gentleness by her surroundings. Softened perhaps too by food and drink, her eyes, dwelling on the grandeur before her, filled with tears. She stretched out her hand. "Despite this horrible and unjust war, I can feel in my heart at the moment nothing but happiness and gratitude." Capor took her hand and pressed it, and an unusual thing with him, addressing her in German, called her little pet names. It was absurd, but touching. Ashenden, leaving them to their emotions, strolled through the garden and sat down on a bench. The view was spectacular. As Ashenden lingered in that spot, he pondered over the mystery of Grantley Capor's treachery. He didn't think Capor had become a spy merely for the money. He was a man of modest tastes. Perhaps he turned spy not from hatred of the country that had imprisoned him, nor even from love of his wife, but from a desire to score off the bigwigs who never even knew of his existence. Perhaps he felt that his talents hadn't received the recognition they merited, or perhaps it was just an impish desire to do mischief. One thing was clear. Capor was disturbed by no gnawing of conscience. He did his mean and despicable work with gusto. He was a traitor who enjoyed his treachery. Ashenden knew that R would have said to him, "Why the devil waste your time with idle speculations? The man's a dangerous spy, and your business is to lay him by the heels." True enough. Ashenden had decided that it would be useless to attempt to make any arrangement with Capor. He could certainly not be trusted. His wife's influence was too strong. So Capor must be caught. But how was he to effect that? All he could do was wait, with his eyes open, to seize any opportunity that might present itself. A couple of days later, an incident occurred that made him certain something was in the wind. In the course of his morning lesson, Mrs. Capor remarked, "My husband has gone to Geneva today. He had some business to do there." Not everyone can tell a lie, and Ashenden had the feeling that Mrs. Capor was telling one then. It flashed across his mind that Capor had been summoned to Bern to see the redoubtable head of the German Secret Service. Ashenden knew in Lucerne a Swiss who was willing to do odd jobs in an emergency. Looking him up, Ashenden asked him to take a letter to Bern. It might be possible to pick up Capor and trace his movements. Next day, Capor appeared once more with his wife at the dinner table, but merely nodded to Ashenden. Afterwards, both went straight upstairs. They looked troubled. The following morning, Ashenden received a reply to his letter. Capor had seen Major von Posen. Ashenden guessed what the Major had said to him. They were tired of paying Capor a salary to sit still in Lucerne and do nothing. The time had come for him to go to England. Guesswork? Of course it was guesswork, but in that trade it mostly was. Ashenden knew from R that the Germans wanted to send someone to England. He drew a long breath. If Capor went, he'd have to get busy. When Mrs. Capor came in to give him his lesson, she was dull and listless. At luncheon they hardly spoke to one another. They left early, but when Ashenden went out, he saw Capor sitting in the hall by himself. "Hello," he cried. "How are you getting on? I've been to Geneva." "So I heard," said Ashenden. "Come and have your coffee with me. My poor wife's got a headache. I told her she'd better go and lie down. The fact is, she's rather worried, poor dear. I'm thinking of going to England." Ashenden's heart gave a sudden leap. "Oh, are you going for long? We shall miss you. To tell you the truth, I'm fed up with doing nothing. I can't sit here indefinitely. I can't afford it. I may have a German wife, but I am an Englishman, hang it all, and I want to do my bit. I could never face my friends again if I just stayed here in comfort till the end of the war." Ashenden saw in Capel's eyes that he didn't want to go to England. He'd wanted his wife to press him to stay, but it was plain she hadn't done that. Perhaps he hadn't dared tell her how frightened he was. To her he'd always been bold, adventurous, devil-may-care. Now, the prisoner of his own lies, he hadn't found it in him to confess himself the coward he was. "Are you going to take your wife with you?" asked Ashenden. "No, she'll stay here." It had been arranged very neatly. Mrs. Capel would receive his letters and forward the information they contained to Bern. "I've been out of England so long that I don't quite know how to set about getting war work. I wonder if there's anyone in the censorship department that you could give me a letter of introduction to." It was only by a miracle that Ashenden saved himself from showing what had just dawned on him. None of this was due to his own cleverness. He'd been a pawn, put in Lucerne, told how to describe himself, and given the proper information so that what had occurred should occur. It was a trap set by that devilish R, and the grim major at Bern had fallen into it. Ashenden had done his work just by sitting still and doing nothing. He almost laughed as he thought what a fool R had made of him. "I was on very good terms with the chief of my department," he said. "I could give you a note to him, if you liked." "That would be just the thing." Later, Ashenden prepared various communications. In one, he informed R that Capel was going to England. In another, he made arrangements through Bern that wherever Capel applied for a visa, it should be granted without question. When he went down to dinner, he handed Capel a cordial letter of introduction. Next day but one, Capel left Lucerne. Ashenden waited. He continued to have his hour's lesson with Mrs. Capel. After his lesson, Ashenden went every morning to Cook's to ask for his letters. Presently he received one from the consul in Geneva to say that Capel had applied there for his visa and had set out for France. That afternoon Ashenden asked Mrs. Capel, "Have you had news of Herr Capel?" "No, I suppose I could hardly expect to yet." Next day, during the lesson, he could see how impatient she was to have done with it. The first post was delivered at Cook's at noon, and at 2:05 she looked at her watch. Though Ashenden knew very well that no letter would ever come for her, he hadn't the heart to keep her on tenterhooks. "Don't you think that's enough for the day? I'm sure you want to go down to Cook's." When a little later he went there himself, he found her standing in the middle of the office, her face distraught. "My husband promised to write from Paris. I'm sure there is a letter for me, but these stupid people say there's nothing. They're so careless." She turned and walked rapidly away. Fritzi followed her, his tail between his legs. There was no doubt of it. Already the fear had seized her that something was wrong. Next morning she looked dreadful. "You must excuse me, Herr Somerville. I cannot give you a lesson today. I'm not feeling well." That evening he got a note from her to say that she regretted that she must discontinue giving him conversation lessons. She gave no reason. Ashenden saw no more of her. She ceased coming into meals. Except to go morning and afternoon to Cook's, she apparently spent the whole day in her room. Ashenden thought of her sitting there, hour after hour, with that hideous fear gnawing at her heart. Who could help feeling sorry for her? The time hung heavy on his hands, too, until one morning the clerk at Cook's handed him a letter. It was from R. "Dear Sir, the goods dispatched by you from Lucerne have been duly delivered. We are obliged to you for executing our instructions with such promptness." R. was exultant. Ashenden guessed that Capel had been arrested and by now had paid the penalty of his crime. That afternoon Ashenden went to Cook's and, obedient to his orders, bought himself a ticket for Geneva. As he was waiting for his change, Mrs. Capel came in. He was shocked at the sight of her. She was blousy and dishevelled, and there were heavy rings round her eyes. She was deathly pale. She staggered up to the desk and asked for a letter. The clerk shook his head. "I'm sorry, madame, there's nothing yet."
"But look. Are you sure? Please look again."
The misery in her face was heartrending. With a shrug, the clerk took out the letters from a pigeonhole and sorted them once more.
"No, there's nothing, madame."
She gave a cry of despair and turned away, the tears streaming from her eyes. Then a fearful thing happened. Fritzi, the bull terrier, sat down on his haunches, threw back his head, and gave a long, melancholy howl. Mrs. Capor looked at him with terror. The gnawing doubt that had tortured her during those dreadful days of suspense was a doubt no longer. She knew.